technically, then theoretically, I should now be live for episode 13 of International Expansion Explained. Seeing as this is the first solo episode that I've done, I would be very grateful if somebody from LinkedIn could maybe put a hi or something in the comments, just so that I know that I'm not talking in public to myself. That would be very nice. Anyway, my plan for today was just to go over a couple of the events that have had the most significant impacts on world trade during 2022 and to talk about a couple of things that I've got planned, especially for this format for next year. Thank you, Susan. Glad to know that there's somebody there who is anonymously hello. Maybe you can put your name in the comments as well, because I can only see LinkedIn user hello. See? Is that you? Um, yeah. So maybe I will start off with a couple of points from the kind of geopolitical scene, which I think probably none of these are going to be. Esme, thank you. Thank you. I think none of these are going to be complete rocket science, but purely to give you my personal take on those. So to start out with, I guess the biggest thing, especially for those of us who are living on the European continent this year, has been the war in Ukraine. And I think whilst at this time last year it would have been quite clear that there was something going on, and I remember having conversations with friends in the Ukraine and with Belarus, that it wasn't so much a question of if, but more a question of when, then I don't think that any of us really had thought that a year later we would still be in a situation of having really war on the doorstep. And of course, on the one hand, it's an absolutely awful human tragedy. But of course, on the other hand, it also means that for many European and also other countries around the world, but two huge markets in Europe have effectively been lost as sales outlets, which is having, of course, a knock on effect. Additional to the fact of huge inflation, energy prices rising, etc., which are the more immediately visible consequences of this. So we will see how this energy and cost of living crisis continues to affect us in 2023 and how that looks as if it's going to continue affecting us also for our export markets and for our international sales plans. The second point, which kind of made all of the headlines, at least in November, was the question of exchange rates, because the exchange rates of both the pound and the euro against the dollar hit kind of record lows, making it quite expensive for a lot of people around the world. Exports became, relatively speaking, cheap, but that wasn't necessarily a good thing for everybody who was looking to purchase from abroad. So I think that people shouldn't underestimate that when the world exchange rates move, then it actually has an effect on your day to day living costs, because it affects the price of the foods that you eat, it affects the price of the oil that most of you put in your cars. So that is also a contributing factor. On the plus side, though, what was great to see, especially at this end of the year, is the fact that worldwide container prices are back to pre pandemic levels. I think the average price of a container is a little bit between um, Europe and or Asia and Europe is down to about 1,400 euros at the moment. Prices to the US are still a little bit higher, maybe, than pre pandemic levels, but on average, then prices are back down to what they were. And compared to the horrendous prices that we had at this time last year, then that is really a huge benefit for anyone who's importing or exporting between the continents. One of the things that brought with it, though, as a consequence, has also been, moving on from COVID, has also been this kind of push against globalization and having global supply chains with purely just in time deliveries. And I know that this has been a topic for the last couple of years, but I think in this year there was finally people were managing to move actually some of their factories closer to home, be that US companies moving into Mexico. It might have taken them almost 2 years or 2.5 years to be able to do that. Um, or companies establishing a second production facility, for example, in Vietnam, and not purely depending on the situation on the Chinese market. So, in that way, companies have been splitting risks. And I know that a lot of other, for example, in the textile industry, a lot of the production has been moved back to countries such as Turkey, Romania, bringing it much closer to the European sales markets, which of course is a benefit for Europe as a whole, but sometimes means that price increases are being passed on to consumers, which in a situation where consumers are not very happy because of cost of living crises, it's a bit of a downward spiral as to how much they're actually able to purchase. And the final point that I wanted to mention as having been a big driver, at least of the part of the business that I'm looking at, because remember, I'm mostly focused on doing business to and from Asia. So I'm not looking, for example, at anything in detail that might be going on in Africa. Then the zero COVID policy in China has been a huge determining factor for a lot of business decisions during the year 2022. We started out with Shanghai going into a really hard lockdown for a couple of months, and then, of course, having rolling lockdowns across various provinces, across various cities. Lots of changes in the regulations at the last minute, and all of this unpredictability has made it really hard for companies to take a decision either to enter into the Chinese market or to stay into the Chinese market. And that wasn't really a sentence, was it? Stay in the Chinese market and make further investments and double down on what they've already been doing. Because when you've got that kind of unpredictability, then it's not really something that you want to bank on for growing your business, especially if there are other markets that you can expand into that are offering you much less risk. Of course, the latest news over the last couple of weeks has been that China seems to have gone from a zero COVID policy to an almost, let's say, 100% COVID policy. There's been a huge surge in cases across the country. It feels like almost everybody that I know in China is positive at the moment, which is a little bit weird, having had 2.5 years where almost nobody that I knew actually caught COVID. And whilst the feeling of fear that it's going to be so deadly is going away in many cases, a lot of people are very aware that the health services are not available on such a scale as they are in, for example, European countries. So the health services are certainly stretched to be able to manage, and hopefully even that they'll be able to restrict the number of deaths, because vaccination numbers especially amongst the elderly, more vulnerable population, are pretty low. So I think that is going to be one of the key influencing factors that is going to go forward with us into 2023, because companies are still going to be unsure about if or when they can start rebuilding their relationships in China, when they can start to depend on being able to visit the market, And of course, whether, let's say, whether China will be able to continue to power economic growth, or whether people will have lost so many people will have lost their livelihoods that they are no longer consuming in the way that Chinese consumers did in the past. And there's been some signs of a there's been a lot of signs of a slowdown. Some industries in China, like the luxury goods industry, have been continuing still to have some growth, but in other sectors, especially in food and beverage, then it's been a really long, tough 2022. So let's hope that that is going to improve for the year ahead. What else? Well, significant deaths, always a few of those in the year. If I did have a look at, or a look back a little bit at who are the people who've shaped some of the aspects of the world as we know it today, and our business environments as we know it today, and our geopolitical environments as we know it today. And there were, for me, 4 particularly significant deaths in 2022. I know it sounds a bit morbid, doesn't it, looking back at all of the deaths, but we're going to do it anyway. First of all was Madeleine Albright, and as with the other people I've got on my list, maybe you don't have to actually agree with their views on the world, but I think that in all of the cases, you can't deny that they had a significant impact on, if I say geopolitics, also business and generally relations across the world. So Madeleine Albright escaped from the Nazis, from the Czech Republic, and landed in the US and managed to rise to Secretary of State for External. I'm rubbish with US titles. But, sorry, I'm having one of those moments. Menopausal moment, potentially. She rose to be the voice of the US externally. And whilst her policies were not everybody's cup of tea, of course, then I think it was significant that with her background, she was able to rise to such a significant position and to make such an impact on the world over such a period of time, and to take a certain number of courageous decisions that are certainly having impacts that are continuing today. The second person whose death, I would say, has closely shaped the world that we're living in right now was Mikhail Gorbachev. And again, you don't have to have agreed with all of his actions, but I think it's clear that his impact on the world, especially at the end, his role in the end of the Soviet Union, is something that we can't deny. And let's see how that situation evolves going forward, because right now it's almost as if Russia has gone back to a state of being maybe as it was 40 years ago, in terms of being isolated from much of the rest of Western Europe and the US, of course, for sure. The third person I've got on my list is Shinzo Abe, the former Japanese premier, who was, thank you, Susan, the former Japanese premier who was assassinated back in autumn. And again, he's quite a polarizing figure, who had quite a hawkish attitude towards China, and towards questions as to how Japan should treat their history, and how they should manage the fact of Japanese military history, especially relating from the Second World War and things that went on in China or in the rest of the Asia Pacific region. But he was certainly a great statesman, and it's a sad state of the world when somebody that you don't agree with gets assassinated because of their beliefs. And of course, last but by no means least, the UK had a change of queen. Well, the queen died, And I think this has certainly across the English speaking world, it's certainly pulled into question a lot of relationships that will be significant, especially for the UK in the years going forward. So I think we need to watch and see what happens, whether countries like Australia and New Zealand will take that particular point in time as a basis of discussion to move away from having the Queen as head of state. We already know that some of the Caribbean islands have already taken that decision before that time. And I think that this could be a kind of watershed moment for the UK to move away from this old colonial past that they've had and think about what their role should be in the world for the future. Because when you're an island of 65 or 68 million people, then you have to really consider how you're going to have an impact on the world, and whether you need to make some apologies to some people, whether you need to change some of your policies, and how that's also going to affect you economically, especially when you're moving from a fairly bad place right now. Yes, those were my points that I'd got written that I wanted to look back upon for 2022. I'd like to also say a really huge thank you to all of the people who came on the show and had interesting, funny discussions with me during this year. So I'm not going to go through the list because I'm sure that I would miss somebody out, even though I've written the list down. But thank you. It has been wonderful, and I'm really grateful for the fact that you came on and were willing to be grilled by me, and willing to put yourselves out there and to talk live in front of LinkedIn. If anybody has any requests as to which kind of topics or for any specific guests that you would like to see in 2023, then please let me know. So I've already had one request for an international recruiter where we could talk about what are the qualities that you need to have and what are the qualifications that you need to have if you would like to work in a kind of international, in various kinds of international career. So that's something that I'm looking into at the moment. But other than that, I do have a list of people who, some of whom have already said yes, they would be willing, and some of whom don't know of their luck yet, but who I will be contacting in the near future so that we can have a discussion and to continue with these discussions for 2023. I'm also hoping for next year that I can expand my YouTube channel a little bit. So that is certainly one of the points that I'm going to have in focus, also producing more solo videos. Thank you, Stella, for Weihnachten, also to you. Thank you for being here. And yeah, I'm also, the other thing that I'm thinking of doing is starting a newsletter on LinkedIn. But I haven't got around to really just getting my head around that. So I'm hoping that over Christmas I'm going to have enough headspace to do that and to come up with something that would be an interesting format for people to participate in. Yes, I think those were the points that I had prepared. If anybody has any questions, then I'm very open for questions. Otherwise, I would say Merry Christmas and would sign off. But if you have questions, then please do drop them in the comments, and I will be only too glad to try to answer them in reasonable sentences without having a coughing attack. So. In which case, as there seems to be no questions today, I would say thank you very much to all of you who came along live. Thank you for following up with it. LinkedIn newsletters, Susan. Partly because I could have a different reach on LinkedIn and would reach some different people to the ones that I've got on my blog email list. That would be my. And the reason I've hesitated to do it is because I prefer to only write to my blog email list. But then I thought maybe I could reach a slightly wider audience by having a LinkedIn newsletter. So that would be my justification on that particular point. Yeah. So I would say thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate all of you and have a wonderful Christmas and New Year break. I hope you all have an absolutely amazing one, and I will be back next year. Take care.